The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower.
Hey everyone, it's Wade Franson here, and we are pre-recording, so this is not live, it'll just seem live. Is it live or is it Memorex? Now I'm dating myself. Anyway, I'm here in the studio with Tom Krattenmaker, and Tom is a writer and commentator on religion in public life with a series or several award-winning acclaimed books with Christianity Today, Top Religion Book of the Year by Religion News Association. He's been focused in recent years on considering what the life and teachings of Jesus might mean in a pluralistic post-Christian society, and increasingly, maybe not even going forward with the name Jesus, because after all, what we're trying to do, or at least what I'm interested in and why I've had him on the show, is turning people towards that religious, spiritual, moral high ground from whatever direction they're coming in, and not getting caught up in names and labels that tend to divide, because we have a very divided society today, with culture wars exploding over every imaginable topics which in the past, nobody would have given a second thought about bringing up, today are polarized and part of some culture war grenade. We're going to hear to sort of unpack and talk about many things on today's show. Welcome to the studio, Tom.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you, Wade. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, and on that little intro, did I kind of get it right? Are we aligned, or are you veering off in a slightly different direction than how I mapped that out?
You got it right. We'll let listeners know that in more recent years, I've been focusing more and more on secular values, a positive articulation of secular life, how that relates to the natural world, which I think is a really important and unrealized source of meaning and purpose and ethical guidance for secular people, but frankly, for everyone.
Well, one of the reasons why this is a little bit of a conundrum, a cone, or difficult for people to digest and swallow is your book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, was the #1 religious book of that year, right?
Yes, I've been struck by that, and I've talked about that quite a bit in the 10 years since the book came out and got that award. And get this, Wade, my book was #2 in that awards contest at Religion News Association. The #1 book was Grace Without God. And so the #1 and 2 religion books, quote unquote, religion books that year were both secular books. But they did pertain to the business of religion, namely ultimate meaning, purpose, truth. But it shows that it shows a struggle in secular America that I write about. And that is that we're still not understood on our own terms as a secular community, still seen as something happening on the religion landscape.
Well, and it's the crux of, and when you know the meaning of the word crux, that's interesting too. It's the crux of the issue
Yes.
of the founding of this nation, which was founded by largely religious people with strong spiritual values and the intent to integrate that, but specifically a society that had freedom of religion, and therefore even the ability to have freedom from religion in some corners. But how does that not become a war? Well, we'll unpack your views, my views on this as we go along. But first, let's get to know the real you by going into your background a little bit. Tell us your creation story. Who were your parents, circumstances of your upbringing, and the forces that shaped you before you could take conscious thought.
I grew up in a place that is in the news a lot these days, the Minneapolis area in Minnesota. And my parents were split, but my mom took my sisters and me to Catholic church, Catholic mass, pretty much every Sunday or Saturday night, as the case would be. And I'm going to be candid with you. I didn't really, as a kid, I didn't really like the church thing very much, but my mom said it was an important thing to do. I was kind of ordered to go, and I did. And most of it didn't mean that much to me, but one thing did, and that was Jesus. And the stories about Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, that really kind of got in my head and my heart and stuck with me, especially this idea that Jesus taught that what you do for those with the least, to put it in my words, is sort of the ultimate test of character and a different way of engaging in the world. And to me, it was so surprising and counterintuitive, especially as I became a teenager, got a little bit older, thought about it more. And I thought that was very impressive. And, you know, the idealist in me, and I've always had that streak, really resonated with that. And so even though I didn't become a church person, Jesus was still in my heart and my head, but a Jesus approached from a more secular perspective.
Well, and unpacking that perspective on Jesus, I've increasingly come to think of Jesus as the master script flipper, right? Because he came into a deeply religious society that anticipated him as the solution to all of their social problems. So they looked to God in a fervently religious way for a savior to come and overthrow the oppressive material forces.
Mm-hmm.
And in order, you know, so deeply fervent religious groups, whatever religion you might belong to, often, you know, create a dystopia when they gain power, because they haven't had the opportunity to implement their ideas in small ways, right? And figure out what does and doesn't work. The theory seems perfect until you apply it and everything
Until you
falls
apply
apart,
it, yeah.
right? So he was trying to educate these people who were wanting him as their savior to overthrow and start the kingdom of God, and yet they weren't ready, much like the tribes of Israel coming out of Egypt weren't ready, right? And so anyway, I don't know, in your view of Jesus, how did you sort of view him? Okay, so kind of counterintuitive to any power structure, right? Serving the least. But what else can you tell us about your view of Jesus at that time?
Well, here's something that really continually surprised me and still surprises me as somebody who pays close attention to the world, the ways of the world, business as usual, because I have this journalism background. From that perspective, what Jesus does, like in the crux moment, is shocking in a very exciting, good way to the idealist. Because the normal way of doing things would be to use his divine power. And when he was being persecuted and forced to march with that cross and then get hung on the cross, he would choose his big moment and then exert his power and vanquish his enemies and take over.
And they were looking for that. They were waiting for that.
Shockingly different. He just submits. Yep. He submits to his own execution, great pain and suffering, all for a greater purpose. And that's astonishing.
Well, in the traditional religious view of that is that, okay, the penalty for our sins was paid.
Yeah,
But
that's substitutionary atonement.
But there are deeper meanings to it, are there not? And not to minimize that, and I don't want to get into the theology of that. Um, we actually have an episode coming up where we're really going to get into that with a different guest.
I'll have
But
to look
so
into
let's
that.
put that aside for a moment. There's a deeper meaning, a deeper purpose. What are we to gather from that? Okay, so my sins have been forgiven. Great. I should love Jesus. I should love God. I should understand they're full of love. Great. But what else does it teach us that
Well,
he
that's what
did
interests
what you
me.
just did? Or you said he did.
That's what interests me. What does it mean to follow Jesus?
Yeah.
That's a difficult thing to do.
So as you were emerging then from this early, emerging consciousness around religion, Jesus, how did that affect the path that you were then choosing as a young
It
man?
gradually led to where I am now, but I wouldn't have known it when I was like 20. It's funny. I'm remembering this conversation I had with my dad, maybe when I was 19 or 20. I said my parents were split, but I still had close contact with my father. And he was very committed to my remaining Catholic and a traditional believer. And we had a
Okay,
very candid conversation.
sorry, let me back up then, because I misunderstood. When you said your parents were split, I thought you meant your mother was the religious one, your father was the non-religious one,
No,
and
they
they
were
were together.
divorced
When did they divorce?
when I was about 5.
Okay, but they were Catholics, and they were both very sincere Catholics. So being divorced, that was a problem in the Catholic world. How did that
Yeah, my
play out?
mother paid the price for that, and it always bothered me. But the divorce that she pursued is something she had to do. I'm just going to be super candid. My father's alcoholism was next level, and she had
Wow,
to do that to protect herself and me and my sisters.
wow.
But my father stayed in our lives, and when he was okay, we were with him, my sisters and me. And he was, as I said, he was very committed to my remaining Catholic. And I remember we would sometimes have deep conversations. I remember one time in the car with him having one of these conversations, and I said that I really didn't believe Jesus was divine. And then I said, but he might as well have been, because his teachings, I probably didn't say it this well, his teachings were so profound and so meaningful and so applicable to so much of what ails us that they might as well have been divine. But I didn't think literally that he had that divinity. And I wasn't bothered by that. I still thought that his story and his teachings and his way were so worthwhile and so compelling and so very much what the world needs.
Amazing. So did your fathers struggle with fulfilling the teachings of the church, and your mother as well? I mean, both of them in that sense were, having difficulty living up to the standards of the church, whether it was the marriage being ending in divorce, whether it was the drinking. How did that affect them and you in terms of their relationship with God and the church?
Well, part of my growing up in Catholicism was cynicism that developed in me, not about Jesus, but about a lot of the other things.
Yeah.
Others of my relatives were very devout too, and they clung strongly to a Catholic identity. But sometimes I would look at my father's struggles. I mean, it's a disease. Now, I don't blame him now. But I looked at his struggles and I thought, what good is his devout religion doing for him? But you know what? As I got older, like late teens, I started to see that church was very consoling for him because he was racked with guilt. He had a good heart. He was in the throes of a disease. And church was someplace he could go for acceptance and consolation and perspective. And hey, the good news here is that later in his life, he finally got sober once and for all.
Wonderful.
And our relationships all deepened. His relationship with my wife and daughter were strong, and I'm very grateful for that. I just wish that period could have lasted longer, but
Yeah.
he died when he was 63.
So is it fair to say that the church and religion, which is intended to be a source of healing, was at least helping with the symptoms, and ultimately he was maybe not healed of the disease, but it went into remission?
Right. And Alcoholics Anonymous has a spiritual and even religious component, and he finally stuck to that.
Yeah.
It was tough for my mom, though. She couldn't go to communion.
Right.
And she was a really good person. And
Yeah.
so it pained me, like when my sisters and I got up and walked up and did communion, and my mother had to sit back in the pews like some kind of flunky. It wasn't her fault he was divorced.
Right. Well, we have a little bit of a similarity. I've shared the fact that with my audience, you may not know this story. My parents divorced. I was kidnapped in a domestic kidnapping, smuggled out of the country. After 2.5 years, it went to the Supreme Court of Sweden, where my mother was finally re-awarded custody by the Swedish courts, who had given my dad custody while the court battle was going on. But part of the reason was she showed up with a husband. Now, my mother was the alcoholic, and her husband was also an alcoholic, and this was a sham marriage. The courts didn't know that. But when they asked my dad, Mr. Franson, what are your plans? He said, I have no plans to remarry. I'm still bound to her.
I
Well, the Swedish courts,
understand.
being non-religious, secular, could easily say, well, I think the kids would have a better future with their mother and a two-parent family. So sad, so bad. You've now lost custody. So I don't know. So for you and me, all of this stuff, in my view, plays into walking that razor's edge between religion, society, belief, practice, what actually works, what is actually real, applying the teachings in the crucible of rubber meeting the road.
I really like what you're saying. When I was working on my book just this morning, I got into some of that.
Well, great. So we're going to get into some of that too here right after this commercial break, having covered a little bit of your backstory, getting to know the real you. I look forward to getting into the meat of your life's work. So don't go anywhere. We'll have a video, which will be probably something of a prophet now, something featuring Tom or his books. And when we come back, we'll dig into his life's work. Don't go anywhere. We're with Tom. Going to try to say it right. Krattenmaker on Created in the Image of God.
Religion has receded in the West, but what hasn't yet emerged, certainly not on a wide scale, is whatever comes next. Tom Krattenmaker writes at the intersection of religion, values, secular life, and the natural world. His work returns again and again to a central question: what provides meaning, connection, and moral grounding in a society no longer organized around traditional religion? A mass return to theism is neither realistic nor likely. Yet the longing remains for community, for shared purpose, for ways of being with others that feel meaningful and real. In his recent writing, Krattenmaker turns toward the natural world as a source for secular meaning, not as something non-religious people merely settle for in the absence of religious belief, but as a source holding richness and depth worthy of celebration. The story science tells of the universe, of stars, planets, and life on Earth, offers a foundation for values, purpose, and a beautiful life. We are made of stardust. The elements forged in exploding stars became the ingredients of life. This is not simply a fascinating idea. It is something to build lives around. Western culture, he argues, is living between paradigms, between stories. The old story has largely played out, and the culture has lost its bearings. What's needed now is a new story, one grounded in the natural world and our scientific understanding of it. We come from the universe. We are intrinsically part of the earth. And once that story is known in our bones, the only remaining question is how to live in a way that is worthy of our great inheritance.
Welcome back. We're launching into the meat. Where's the beef? Well, here it is, the meat of today's show with Tom Krattenmaker. So, Tom, tell us how you then translated all this childhood experience and desire to pursue a path into a path and your life's work.
At first, it was very journalistic. From the time I was a teenager, I wanted to be a journalist. And I majored in that as an undergraduate. I immediately got a job at a newspaper, went on to a wire service, and I was into it. It meant a lot to me. I thought it was a noble profession, sometimes exciting. And so that's what I did until I was 30. I eventually let that go, mainly for parenting reasons, not as a career move, but I was in the unique situation of being a single father with primary custody when my daughter was a toddler. And my work at the Associated Press was not compatible with that. And after a lot of thought, I gave up my journalism, at least my journalism as a day career or as a day job. I gave it up and went into higher ed communications for a more stable working arrangement. But I kept doing writing and journalism on the side. A key thing for me was that I entered a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania in something called religion in public life. And I went into it because I thought it was a good story, to use the journalist's phrase, because I knew that there was a lot of conflict and unresolved issues at that intersection of religion and politics and culture.
What
And I
year
was
was that?
interested in that and thought it was an important thing to study. I didn't do it for any career payoff. I didn't know what it would lead to, and I didn't care. I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah,
But,
what year was that when you went into that?
well, I finished that master's program around 04.
Okay, so this was after the moral majority. It was like during the Tea Party. Speaking of what's going on in society, or
Yeah, the moral majority and some similar organizations were very strong now, and there was a lot of strong rhetoric about a war on Christians. And just about the time I was wrapping up my master's degree, I got the chance to start writing columns for USA Today. And I became a member of the board of contributors, which means you're a regular, you're not on staff per se, but you have an official relationship with the newspaper. And so for many years, I was writing columns for that newspaper about things happening at this intersection of religion, culture, and politics. It was my specialty. And some books came out of that, my study of what was happening with evangelical Christianity and pro sports. And that led to my awareness of some evangelicals who were not fitting the stereotype and were doing very Jesus-y, inspiring things. And I felt they deserved a book. And so I wrote The Evangelicals You Don't Know, which was about this group that I consider to be the new evangelicals in America. And then conversations with some of these evangelical friends of mine led to my really thinking about, what is my own identity? I wasn't saying it very explicitly, but I was really drifting away from traditional belief and really finding my identity as a secular person, but I still cared about Jesus and was still inspired by Jesus. And so I cooked up this idea for writing a book about it. And thankfully, I got the chance to write it for Penguin Random House for the Convergent imprint. And that was my 2016 book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower. And interestingly enough, it was thinking about Jesus and thinking about the Jesus teaching regarding abundant life that led me into this deeper exploration of what would abundant life look like and mean for secular people, whether they got it from Jesus or not. And that led to what was for me a very seminal article and the beginning of my fascination with the natural world, combined with my own experiences. Wade, all the time I was living out in Portland, Oregon, I was going on epic backpacking journeys. I became a mountain climber. And it was fun, but it was only later in that process that I began to think about these experiences and what they really meant in terms of meaning of life questions. What is it about the natural world besides the excitement and beauty of it? So all this came together beginning around 17 or 18. I wrote this article that was really seminal for me. The headline was Life and Why It Must Continue. And I got into that by following the idea of abundant life, a la Jesus.
may I press pause for a moment and just unpack a couple of things?
Please.
So I'm all these thoughts, connections, and ideas are flooding over me as I listen to you.
Okay.
And I'll just throw out a couple of things. One is, I set before you life and death. Therefore, choose life that you and your children may live. Right? This is a commandment, Deuteronomy chapter 6, I believe, a very important one, where the divine creator tells us to do what you're doing. And I had never tied it into Jesus's abundant life statement. Not just to survive, but to thrive.
That's how I look at it.
right? So that's one thing. The other thing is the two creation stories, because there are two, and people have, made a big deal about this, about how the Bible is conflicting, and it's nonsense, ridiculous. The first creation story in Genesis 1 shows a very hands-off God bringing order out of chaos, right? Um, let there be light, let the dry land separate from the water, right? And then let it bring forth life. And then, and then structuring who eats what and how, right? And then it progresses from there. The second one, this very hands-off God that just uses a word to bring order out of chaos, bends down and with his own hands in the dust shapes a man, and then mouth-to-mouth resuscitation breathes life. You follow me? A very different view of that same God. And the bottom line is, others, throughout theological history have kind of mentioned what I call the two curricula, right? The divine curriculum of revelation, and then the laboratory curriculum of the creation itself, where we go into the laboratory and we figure out how this stuff works. But both of these ask us to, again, test our beliefs, our ideas in the crucible of rubber meeting the road in the material world, right? And so your focus on abundant living and life abundantly, whether or not you're pulling it from a religious idea, a teaching that you don't necessarily consider divine, but just practically can work, might be counterintuitive, but you look under the hood and this is how things should work. It's not how they do work, but if we changed the way we did it, some fundamental alchemy would happen and things would get better.
I like your use of the word laboratory. And it kind of tees up something I've been thinking about and talking about a lot. I think the natural world is a great laboratory and it's a great teacher. I think that if you really examine it and contemplate it and allow yourself to behold its magnificence, and it's not only that, we realize there's a destructive aspect to it, but if you really take it in, you can learn so much from it. You can find purpose, you can find meaning, you can learn ethics, and it goes on and on. And when it comes to abundant life, I thought about that a lot. Sure, it's more life. We want our lives to continue, but it's also better life. And not just for ourselves, but for others too. It's an expansive view of life. How can life flourish? And what makes life flourish? And how can we learn from that and participate in that?
So how have you applied that as you were doing this stuff with USA Today, and I'm remembering now, I know I've read some of your work decades ago, right? Probably when I resigned from the ministry in 1995, but I continued in kind of a lay ministry, preaching at a variety of churches for 10 years until about 2004. I think one of the very last sermons I gave was actually in Estonia, where I was invited back because I had been the first pastor of that church in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, for our denomination. So I'm sure, and I was in something called Family Ministries, and I was in that space of knowing what's going on. I'm sure I've read some of your work, and maybe it even influenced sort of my path more towards the direction that you're on and in. But so tell us a little bit more about how the stepping stone. So, and how did you get involved with Yale, where you're director of communications? And I know that's completely independent of the work we're talking about, but the path that you were on, how did that work out for you?
Well, as I mentioned, I gave up journalism as a quote day career when I was around 30 for parenting reasons. And I started working at universities. I worked at Princeton, Swarthmore College, Lewis and Clark College out in Oregon. And now I'm communications director at Yale Divinity School. I mean, obviously there's a connection. I'm at a divinity school. All around me are great theological thinkers and learners and ideas. And I do a lot to communicate those to the wider world. And so they do inform my own writing. They're in my head. They're in the air I breathe and the water I drink here. And so that contributes. I would like to think,
are you a bit of a translator then? Would you feel that that's a fair description of what you do? You're a translator.
A translator for the secular audience, which is the audience I'm most trying to reach these days with my own writing. And translating is something I always do, and that's the word I use for it.
Wow.
I remember even telling my daughter about that, because she was hearing some things about religion, having a hard time believing it. And I talked to her about the art of translating it so that it would make sense to a less religious person and could become something that would really internalize and run with. So that is exactly the word. I would like to think, too, that communication skills inform my work, too, and my journalism skills. It's not just about having these good ideas, assuming they're good, but it's about the ability to communicate them in a way that's clear and relatable.
Well, and the word laboratory, I chose it. I'm glad it resonated. I chose it not in the sense of, a mad scientist perfecting his theorem for world domination. No, in the sense of my daughter's, going into college as a freshman this coming fall, and we toured colleges, and one of them has a really good laboratory program where you go into the lab, and that's where you figure out if you've understood what you had in theory and if you can apply it in real life. It's from an educational perspective, laboratory is I'm sure what you also meant by it.
Yeah. I think there is a place for abstractions and philosophical concepts. They can be great, but I think it's always good to pursue those at the same time you're keeping touch with physical reality and scientific understandings. And to put it very plainly, seeing what works, what applies. And that echoes what you said a little while ago.
Yeah. Okay. So, what are we're in the next segment? We're going to talk about where you're growing next. But what are the things that you have recently completed and accomplished, sort of at the pinnacle of your career to date that you're happy about, that you feel are finding some resonance, and what are the outcomes of those?
It's the articles I've been writing over the past 8 years or so about secular values and the natural world. Doing my part to try to help create and articulate a positive vision for secular life. And I wrote some articles that were like manifestos. Most of these were in the Humanist magazine. And then when Only Sky started just a few years ago, a publication by and for secular people, I wanted to get involved in that. My time with USA Today was coming to an end. And so I jumped in with Only Sky, reaching far fewer people. It's a much smaller audience, but it's an audience that really matters to me. And it's a chance to write the kind of pieces I want to do right now. Not everything has to be headline driven as it is when you're writing for a newspaper like USA Today. So that's meant a lot to me. And so I've had these articles, and now they're sort of all coming together in this opportunity to write a book about secular purpose and the natural world. That means a lot to me. I worked hard to find a publisher off and on these past few years, and it's finally come together, and I signed a book contract back in November. I'm working on the book every day. I'm writing it. It's exciting. I feel like I'm onto some good things. We'll see what other people think. The book will come out in 2027.
Yeah, it's a long journey to write a book for a major publisher.
That it is.
So, teeing up the next segment that we'll come to after this commercial break, your work then, again, translating more broadly, but some of the headwinds of this, and I'm reminded of Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, where it says the center does not hold, right? And the center is not holding in American society today. We have increasing polarization, and there are many reasons for it, but one of them, just one of them, I am singling it out right now at this moment, but I don't intend to single it out. But one of them is media, right? Which is a business, and therefore has to get eyeballs and attention and clicks. And one way to get that is to drive polarization. and then appeal to one side or the other. Whereas you're a translator, you're translating religious ideas. So there, I subscribe to a variety of magazines and news sources so that I'm well informed broadly across the spectrum. And there's the Freedom from Religion Society, and there's, I think you mentioned, was it the Humanist, or but there,
the Humanist Association.
But there's a magazine called Reason, and there are these various ones that I've subscribed to where they're frankly anti-God and they're anti-religion, and they're driving the movement, let's call it the movement on the left, and then there's others driving the movement on the right, where they're pandering, they're selling red meat or blue meat, as the case may be, and furthering the polarization. But that's not the space that you're trying to inhabit, if I understand correctly. Right. Your work might be challenging, but it would be challenging to both sides.
As I wrote in the final pages of my Secular Jesus Follower book, there are aspects of the world that disappoint me so much and frustrate me. And one thing that is compelling about Jesus to me is the way that his way and his teachings address those disappointing things and finds creative solutions to those. But speaking of disappointing things, I hate it when people are incentivized to do bad things. And in this case, it's like you were saying, a kind of journalism or rhetoric that feeds off of polarization and that stokes anger and resentment and then benefits from it or monetizes it. I really hate that. I don't want to be part of that. And what you said also tees up something I observe about the secular world. There's still a branch of it that is still fighting religion and spending a lot of time protecting against encroachments by religion on things like separation of church and state and on space for people to be authentically non-religious. And some of that work is important. I don't say it's wrong, but I'm more interested in what you were talking about, sort of a way to bring forward understandings of religion and secular values and a certain set of values that drive toward a more unified society where there's mutual understanding and the ability to work together.
Well, we'll dig into that as far as the next segment. Where are you growing next? When we come back from this commercial break, don't go anywhere. Be right back with more of Tom Krattenmaker on Created in the Image of God.
Philip Yancey's gripping memoir, Where the Light Fell, unravels his transformative journey from a strict southern USA upbringing to a life devoted to grace. Amidst a church portraying God as a stern enforcer, Yancey humorously labels himself in recovery from a toxic experience. Early encounters with contradictions led him to explore through books, challenging his upbringing, and eventually questioning his faith. Yancey's return to faith unfolds gradually, marked by encounters with a world different from his teachings. Resonating with millions through bestsellers like Disappointment with God, his memoir reflects on this journey as a prequel, tracing his evolution from fundamentalism to a life dedicated to unraveling Christianity's deepest mysteries. Brace yourself for a captivating book that promises reflection and inspiration. Where the Light Fell by Philip Yancey. Available now.
Welcome back. We're going to talk about the center now and how Tom Krattenmaker is being a translator within right now the world of surrounded by theologians, and as a director of communicator having to, in his day job, communicate out to the world that might not be attuned in the same way. So Tom, this book that's coming out that you're working on, what are you discovering? How is it changing your views, and how is it changing the way in which you communicate or translate?
The more I follow this trail, the more amazed I am about the enormous potential and the richness of the natural world. Now, I've always liked the outdoors. I've always been sort of captivated by mountains and forests. And as I alluded to earlier, when I was living in Portland, Oregon, I got into mountain climbing as well as backpacking. And those were exciting experiences, but I can't say they were always super deep. it was fun. And I enjoyed being with the other people, like on the climb team or the people I was backpacking with. But I can't say that it went into deep contemplation about what the natural world was doing and teaching. But by more recent experiences and research, the courses I've been taking, the articles and books I've been reading, they've all been leading me toward a deeper engagement and a more meaningful engagement with the natural world. And I love how it's helping me in my quest to articulate a positive vision for secular life. And so my work now is bringing together my two major interests and passions: secular purpose and meaning, and the wonders of the natural world. And
So
to me, that's a very strong combination.
let me take a step back then. I mean, one of the things that kind of fascinates me is how the book of Revelation has four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? And the apocalypse, you know, gloom and doom, hailstones falling from heaven, famine, hunger, war, and the sun getting 10 times hotter, climate change, right? Well, the modern day four horsemen of the apocalypse are riding from the direction of science. It is science, broadly writ, that is predicting the ride of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Climate change. And this is fascinating to me, you know, how this is all unfolding. But the reason I bring it up in this context is when you start talking about the natural world and what we actually would need to do to avert these catastrophes, it is a restructuring of society, but not necessarily, in my view, in the way that is being recommended. Rather, urbanization is itself a problem, the mass aggregation of millions of people into large cities and them becoming divorced from having their hands in the dirt, having a little plot of garden. I mean, during World War II, the victory gardens, I mean, statistics are like 85 or more % of Americans were growing some of their own food, right? And just to have that in some way reoccur would seem necessary to actually fundamentally change society. So
yeah, that's right.
So I don't know if you get into any of those sort of real nitty gritty, what would actually have to change sort of ideas?
Well, the stuff I'm dealing with goes beyond politics. It's about transformations, internal transformations. Some would say transformations of the heart. You were really onto some important things there. You were talking about the four horsemen. I remember maybe around 2003, 2004, when the new atheists emerged, like
Yep.
Hitchens and Dawkins. They were
Yep.
called the four
Exactly.
horsemen of the
They
new
were.
atheism.
Yeah.
And I remember too, when I was writing my USA Today columns, one was about the secular and liberal form of apocalypticism, but it wasn't like the return of an avenging God. It was climate change that was going to wreak havoc and vengeance. So those are very perceptive things you said. So we need a transformation. I think this transformation is good in and of itself. It happens to be what the world needs now. I mean, this earth that we've been neglecting and that we've been alienated from, it needs our attention and care. I think we need to reorient lives around this earth, this dirt.
Yeah, and we you know, again, I referenced creation, right? We were made from the dust. I like to say dead dust. We weren't even soil. Soil is a living thing. Dust is dead, inert, right? We did this thing down at something called the Desert Rose Baha'i Institute, where we flew down. We had a couple of pastors, a Baptist pastor and one who's more Pentecostal, fly in from Virginia, and some folks from up in Wisconsin to this Baha'i Institute. And we created a little farm to table thing at the Desert Rose, which the intent was that the desert shall blossom like a rose, right? But they hadn't actually had a whole lot of blossoming. I mean, they did have some trees and some, you know, drip irrigation, and they were slowly over many decades transforming it a little bit. And it's a conference center kind of thing. but we actually put in a garden, and we had to take biochar, and we had to take bat guano, right? Because we had to mix it with this dead desert dust in order to turn it into soil. And we did, right, with these kids. It was awesome. So my point being, going way back to the first stories, you find this is the topic, and the very purpose for which Adam was put on this planet, it says, was to dress and keep the garden. That came first. It was only after that that Eve was created, and the commandment became be fruitful and multiply. And these twin, the purpose and the commandment is the yin and yang of the struggle, right? Do we actually dress and keep the garden, or are we the most invasive species the world has ever seen? Figuring this out, we're still dealing with it.
Yeah, it's important. I recently realized that the etymology of the word human is humus, i.e. dirt, soil, ground, earth, which makes a world of sense. And when you internalize that, it means a lot. We have become alienated, especially those of us who live in urban settings, which has been my case for a long time now. I mean, I love cities, but I'm starting to see more and more how they can alienate me from the natural world. It's really hard to see the stars because of light pollution.
Light pollution. We were in Hawaii here a month ago now. We were up at the top of Mauna Kea, and we went up there to be above the clouds to see the sun set into the clouds from above, and then when it got dark to see the stars. And I was so irritated. My kids were like flipping out, Dad, chill, chill, chill. Because I went up there to get away from the light pollution, because as a kid I lived in a tent in Alaska as a teenager, and then I overnighted near Eilat and by in the Sinai Peninsula, and the stars that I saw are amazing. I wanted my kids to have that experience, and people were like not turning their lights off. This was like the guest center at the base of, you had to get a 4-wheel drive to go up further, but we were at 9,300 feet, and people were like, keeping their lights on in the car, inside their cars and outside their cars, and driving in and out. Nobody was like, there was no reverence for, we're here to see the stars. And the experience was polluted because of careless people who didn't give a flip. And there were people from the center walking around telling people to turn their lights off, and people weren't doing it.
Well, that's frustrating. I disapprove of that.
Yeah. But even so, that's another way to connect, by looking at the heavens or looking down into the earth, right?
Please tell me people weren't just staring at their phones.
That was probably happening a little,
That's another reason why I feel we become alienated from terra firma, and it's problematic as can be.
Well, we look forward to staying in touch. We're out of time. This has been amazing. I will have to invite you back as you get closer to publishing that book. I know you're going to go through a transition later this year and dive more deeply into this work. What final words would you like to leave with our audience today?
Touch grass. Having that contact with physical.
Which kind of grass are you talking about? Because it's...
Okay, I didn't think of that. You might have to edit this. Okay, I'll rephrase that. Stay in contact with the natural world. Pay attention to the plants and the soil and the stars.
So it's not just stop and smell the roses, it's maybe plant one too.
I like that. Yes, I endorse that. And
Awesome.
If you're going to be at the top of a mountain to look at the stars, turn off your lights.
All right, Tom, it's been truly a pleasure. I hope we stay in touch and have you back on and talk more about this book. For everybody else, there's one thing left today, and that is the sneak peek of next week's show. But remember, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you all next week. Hey everyone, it's your host Wade Franson, created in the image of God. I have a very special guest here recording a sneak peek today. This is a scholar and a wonderful human being that I've recently come into contact with, who has dedicated her life to studying what the Latin community in America actually believes and why. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Walsh, or Sanchez Walsh, sorry.
Hi, Wade. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Let's see. They believe nothing and everything. Okay, so the Latin community cannot be easily put in two categories, even though that's usually what they try to do. And they meaning the media, scholars, whoever kind of comes in contact and wants to explore this community and understand the community a bit better. Um, Yes. Are they overwhelmingly of some Christian denomination? Very much so. But they're not all Catholic. They're not all evangelical. They're not all conservative. They're not all liberal. They're not all anything. There's a huge growth of Latin people who are secular. And within that category, they don't want to be bound by atheist, agnostic, non believing. They just like don't believe. They just choose not to. So we have to kind of unpack that and go, what does that mean? What do all of these new things mean, predominantly among younger people, right? So that's kind of where I explore things, is people who believe a lot of different things, because religion is fluid. Religious identity is fluid. So number one, the couple of things that I started with, and then we can move on from there with our sneak peek, and certainly join us later on in the spring when we get to this in your normal show. Is they believe a lot of things and nothing. And how do we unpack that? We just say that religious identity is fluid, just like ethnic identity is fluid. And so how do we capture those fluid identities when they merge together?
Well, and one of the things that's interesting is the recent article that you wrote about theological education and the challenges in that. And I feel like one of the challenges is we all both want to have an identity, but we all resist having labels applied to us. Is that accurate?
It is. It is, because we all, either whether we work on it, whether we actively seek it, we have changed our identities all over the place. When we were younger, we wanted to be certain things. When we were in high school, for sure. With adolescence, we changed. With adulthood, we changed. When we were in our careers, and we're kind of seeing towards the tail end of our careers to figure out what are we going to do in our quote unquote golden age, all of this stuff. So, but the effort that people put into changing, and whether they recognize that change in others, whether they recognize the identity changes and the fluidity in others, is always the challenge.
And we'll dig into that topic in the show, which will air on March 24th, 2026, with Dr. Arlene Sanchez Walsh. You're not going to want to miss this show. Be there.